Now, we all have the stereotype of the quintessential Englishman. Stiff upper lip, rarely showing emotion, and maybe even somewhat arrogant. Well, what's remarkable for this course is that this very stereotype was perpetuated in the colonial infrastructure of the late 19th century Raj. In many ways, the stereotype of the quintessential Englishman was born in the administration of the Indian plains. In this lecture, we're going to examine attitudes and infrastructure which had buttressed the Raj by 1900. Specifically, we're going to look at the Indian civil service, which was the main bureaucratic system that allowed a few thousand Englishmen to administer over 350 million Indians. The attitudes of the late governing Raj were manifest in the ways the country was administered and how the ICS functioned, was staffed and administered. To understand this, we're going to examine three major themes. Firstly, we're going to look at a particularly British form of racism, which largely saw Indians as unable to govern themselves. This created the conceptual justification for the British Raj and the reason for the British to be in India in the first place. Secondly, we're going to examine the actual backgrounds of British administrators. It's fair to say the officers of the Raj came from fairly elite British backgrounds. So they brought with them a vision of a layered, hierarchical society with them to India, and largely saw Indians as little children who needed the firm, paternal guidance of British rule. Thirdly, we're going to examine the larger structure of the Indian civil service and how its officers governed at the local, village level, and the attitudes which actually underlined this whole apparatus. It's really important for us to understand how the institutions of the Raj shaped racial and cultural ideas. We'll also see how the attitudes of the personnel reflected by the official mindset of the larger British Raj by 1900. Let's start now with an overview of the state of Indo-British personal relations and racial attitudes after the 1860s. As we saw from previous lectures, the Great Uprising shook Britain's rule of India to its core and led to fundamental changes in the way Britain governed India. And this spilled over into Indo-British relations. It hardened Britain's sense of imperial mission in India, but it also distanced friendly interactions between the British as rulers and Indians as subjects. The British, now more than ever, saw themselves as a true ruling race. In their logic, 1857 was a rejection of the supposedly benevolent modernizing rule of Britain. And since Indians had rejected it, they therefore had to be somewhat lower than Europeans and were unable to rule themselves. Lord John Lawrence, a Viceroy of India in the 1860s, actually called the 1857 uprising a war of the races. By the late 19th century, this attitude had crystallized into a hardened racial one. Though it only toyed with scientific racial theories, most colonial officials loosely subscribed to it. One lieutenant governor tellingly said that, quote, "No one will doubt for a moment that the Indian is far inferior to the Englishman." And this was reflected in the way geographical space and interactions were unofficially policed. For example, the local British club was nearly always off-limits to Indians, unless they were Maharajas or eminent elites. In Simla, which became the summer capital of the Raj after 1864, signs were posted outside the main thoroughway: Indians and dogs not allowed. And there was another element which underscored this deterioration of racial relations after 1857. As we've mentioned, the Indian uprising came 100 years after the Battle of Plassey, the beginning of British rule. So British ruling circles started to see 1857 as a Muslim plot to restore the Mughal Empire. After all, Indian Muslims lost out the most to British colonial rule. They did carry some of the most resentment. But it begs the question, was it really a plot to get the British out 100 years after Plassey? Not really. Indian Muslims did have substantial grievances, but their participation in the uprising, as we've seen, was patchy and fragmented. And some landed elite Indian Muslims, such as Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, denounced the mutineers as rebels. And the mutineers who rallied around the aged Mughal emperor in Delhi included both Hindus and Muslims. Yet what this generated was what we could call Islamophobia. Using a racial prism, British officialdom started to see Indian Muslims as inherently rebellious and disloyal. One famed publication by William Hunter was titled, quote, "The Indian Musulmans, are they bound in conscience to rebel against the Queen?" This more pointed and indeed poignant Islamophobia, combined with hardened racial attitudes, would define British policy and how the Raj governed India for the next 3 generations. Nowhere do we see this better than in what kind of rulers the British saw themselves. A century earlier, company officials would have railed against the Oriental and Moorish despotism of Indian rulers. By 1900, they had ironically styled themselves as the very despots they previously railed against. For example, modernizing administration was made more cautious, and laws were supposed to be simple and uncompromising. This would make it easier for Indians, who the British believed to be unable to govern themselves and let alone have political thoughts of nationalism, to be ruled. Here are a few quotations which perfectly capture these attitudes. Quote, "If we ever wish to govern the natives of India effectively, we must treat them as they are and not as civilized and intellectual beings. The laws which we make for them should contain the rules of the most simple kind and easiest to obey." Here's another. Quote, "We should be in a position to pass whatever laws and impose what taxes we choose without the slightest misgiving or regard for Indians." So as we can see, the racial attitudes of the Raj, which were not monolithic but shared by a good share of officialdom, were reflected in the way India was governed. There's one city that represents the Raj's racial attitudes in physical form: Simla, the cool hill town in North India. The British turned Simla into a summer retreat to escape the summer heat of the Indian plains. The whole bureaucracy and machinery of the Raj packed up onto railways every summer and headed north, and it created what was almost an English village at the foothills of the Himalaya mountains. If you look at pictures of Simla, the city looks like it could be in merry old England. For example, we see Tudor-style houses, an English church set against verdant, hilly forests. And this symbolized really a few things. First, it reflected the mindset of the Raj that saw India as a duty, almost a burden. But it was a duty that was not based on empathy for India, its culture, people, and civilization. It was somewhat of a contradictory imperial attitude, which at the end of the day reinforced these prevailing racial attitudes of the late Victorian era. In India, these officials lived a good life. In fact, some historians have argued they were the best paid imperialists in the world. But it also allowed some of them to live insouciantly in India, often aloof from Indian norms and realities. As one female observer noted about her husband and his official colleagues, quote, "They loved India, but they loved it because of polo, bridge, coffee, social circles, and servants." Now that we've covered the racial attitudes of the late Victorian Raj, let's now proceed to understand the backgrounds of the officials who actually governed and administered India. The administrative and governing core of the Raj's personnel came from some of the more privileged parts of British society, and they can be divided into roughly 2 groups who sometimes often overlapped. On the one hand, you had members of the British aristocracy. These included lesser lords such as barons and dukes. The British aristocracy, we should remember, were slowly losing out to a democratization of British politics and the emergence of an industrial national economy, where land was losing its centrality. And India was certainly a place where the British had no intent of introducing democratic elements, either at a local or national level. For many of these lesser aristocrats, India kind of represented a bygone, more noble era. It was an era where there was class and hierarchy, and where people, quote-unquote, knew their place. But instead of class, India had caste, which was almost a substitute for the layers these aristocrats so missed back in England. Sir Edward Lutyens, the architect behind the planning of the city of New Delhi, noted that if the British Empire made him feel very Tory or conservative, then India made him feel pre-feudal Tory. Most of these aristocrats tended to serve as viceroys, provincial governors, and chief magistrates in the upper echelons of the Raj's power. Now let's move on to examine the larger structure of the Indian civil service, how its officers governed at the local village level, and the attitudes which underlay all of these. The Raj was bureaucratically administered by the Indian Civil Service, known as the ICS. It was often called the steel frame of the Raj. It consisted of roughly around 1,000 civil servants, who until the 1920s came almost exclusively from Oxford and Cambridge universities. They were young British men in their mid-20s to 40s. After they had passed a competitive examination held in London, they would go on to finish their training at the Indian Institute at Oxford University. After this training, they would go on to fill specialized posts in bureaucratic departments, such as forestry, public works, and education. These ICS men were guaranteed a well-compensated career, tenure, and pension. And in villages, they became the face of the Raj, often in khaki shorts and a dusty pith helmet. So in sum, the ruling cadre of the Raj came from an overwhelmingly privileged, well-to-do part of British society. They all shared a disdain for popular politics and sympathetic concerns for the working masses. And it was, crucially, this attitude which was transplanted to India when they had to deal with their peasants, cultivators, and holy men of various stripes. And reflecting the racial attitudes of the late 19th century, Indians made up less than 4% of the ICS. It was technically open to Indians, but the examinations were only held in London. Plus, general racial prejudice meant Indians had to surmount considerable hurdles to pass. There were many able candidates, but it was this subtle discrimination that would later be pointed out by more loyalist Indian critics of British rule in the late 19th century. Now, for sure, this was a very elite cadre. These British officials were convinced of what they saw as their duty to rule and administer India. Perhaps the best way to describe the governing mentality of the ICS is paternalist. These were tough-minded men who thought that they were doing good for Indians. And here's how we can think about it. They saw Indians as little children who needed a firm hand. These ICS officers were used to giving orders and being obeyed. Now, let's ask ourselves, do parents consult their children over important household matters such as mortgages, expenditure, relations with neighbors? Usually not. For the British, household meant India, and for children, read Indians, even if they're English-speaking, highly educated, or even of noble or royal lineage. The ICS engendered one of the major ideological underpinnings of colonial rule, and it was the idea that only British men could fairly and justly rule India. If Indians were allowed to govern themselves, they would be divisive, corrupt, and dishonest. Caste got in the way anyway. The British believed that India would fall into chaos. So the British saw themselves as the parents, even if they shared no genetic connection with their so-called children. In fact, this paternalistic ICS attitude was perhaps best captured in the film Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. In one particular scene, Dr. Jones meets a visiting British military officer to Pankot Palace. Captain Blumpert explains that he doesn't want to be inconvenient. He merely wishes to oversee and inspect the Maharaja's fine Indian troops. The Maharaja's Prime Minister sarcastically notes, "Oh, the British worry so much about their empire. Makes us all feel like well-cared-for children." And the ways in which the ICS men were expected to behave with Indians was a direct reflection of these prevailing racial attitudes. These men, for example, couldn't get too friendly or close with Indians. Being seen in a way as sympathetic with or too close to Indians was frowned upon by expatriate British folk and British officialdom. It could cost you a promotion. Now, let's focus a bit more on a specific post that was crucial to the Raj and the ICS at the real local level. It was the district collector. Known perhaps comically as a sun-roasted and dried bureaucrat, he was known locally as a mabap, literally meaning mother-father. Do you know how the British interpreted this? My lord. The district collector was often in charge of a district of anywhere between 1 and 3 million people. They often had 30-year careers with comfortable benefits and pensions. The collector was the representative of the Raj's authority for Indians in their day-to-day local affairs. He was seen as the local hukum, or the one who gives orders. So let's put ourselves in the boots of these district officers, so to speak. What do you think their main responsibility was? Well, the collector's main priority was the maintenance of law and order, so as to allow Britain to effectively harness India's economic, material, and military benefit. The district collector was the person on the spot in the district responsible for remitting India's agrarian revenue and taxation all the way up to the coffers in Calcutta. Now, the district collector was not necessarily a local tyrant, but he did exercise considerable autocratic, bureaucratic authority. He was basically an unchecked county emperor, albeit bound by paper bureaucratic regulation from Calcutta. But he had a number of tools at his disposal. Now, let's stop for a moment and think about local government, where all things really take place. What are some things that local governments usually control? Well, think. Firearm licenses, building permits, local taxation, and sanitation. The district collector had thousands of powers. He was like a local mayor, albeit without an administrative cabinet. And he was certainly not there through popular vote. The collector could adjust tax and revenue rates, administer famine relief, decide legal disputes between different parties, and, perhaps most importantly, dispense political patronage. District collectors controlled access to government employment and the spending capabilities of local government. These were remarkably influential tools. I mean, think about it. The collector could offer employment and patronage to loyal Indians, and by contrast, could withhold it from seemingly disloyal ones. And in a society so attuned to honor and social standing, it turns out the district collector possessed a crucial tool of governance. The district collector had a power to sort of raise or relegate Indians' social standing, especially when it came to land. For example, if a zamindar or landlord fell afoul of a district collector, he could slowly chip away at his social standing. The collector, for example, might marginalize him from provincial or local politics by offering more protection to the peasants on his lands. Or he might either invite or disinvite him from very elite British social gatherings. These were powerful tools. And even though they were crucial to the company's consolidation in Bengal country, as we've seen, zamindars' reputations could be crushed, as we can see from this 15-year-long overlapping bureaucratic paper trail from central India. First collector writes, quote, "This zamindar is a scoundrel. He needs to be crushed." Second collector, 5 years later, "I have crushed him." Third collector, 5 years later, "Found him crushed." Now, this is all good and well, but you must be asking yourself, surely there were some parts of India that required a bit more, can we say, stick than carrot? You're spot on. You see, if legal proceedings and patronage failed, district collectors always had a final resort and recourse to sheer overwhelming force: the Indian Army. In the daily life of local administration, the army was rarely used to crush internal dissent at a massive level. Often enough, the mere threat of force could be employed as a local political tool. If one collector had an upstart Indian village leader, he could note very gently that a Nepali Gorkha regiment was in town on tour. This might persuade some less cooperative Indians to become more cooperative. District collectors and ICS men also maintained an image of gods in the eyes of some Indians. Since they were the source of local authority, to some, their powers were awesome and powerful. Remember that moment in E.M. Forster's famous, albeit critical novel, A Passage to India. India likes gods, and Englishmen like posing as gods. Now, thus far, we've covered how the racial attitudes of the Raj were reflected in this paternalism of the ICS and its officers. Yet these attitudes were also reflected in how the British started to bureaucratically administer and indeed modernize India. Let's be blunt. The Raj by 1900 had built up one of the most paper-ridden bureaucratic states in the world. Now, when you walk into a local county government office and you need something, does the person behind the desk genuinely care for you and your well-being? Usually not. And how do they find out what you need? Well, they give you a paper form to complete, usually many. This is how the late 19th century Raj ruled most of India. Not by learning the Indian constitution, traditions, customs, and religions, but through paper-based authority. Because think about it. Do you have to really personally interact with someone if you have them fill out forms and paperwork? No. And this is how the racial attitudes of the Raj were reflected in the infrastructure and governance of India. Whereas under the company, officials earlier relied more on human and social intelligence to know and administer India, the later Raj kept a disdainful distance from Indians. Bureaucracy, if you think about it, was a way of exercising power aloofly and from a distance. This went in a way, crucially, that British knowledge of India started to become more ossified in the census, statistical land surveys, and various colonial ethnographies on caste. Again, British knowledge of India became more bookish, became more taxonomical and encyclopedic. Gone were the days of Sir William Jones, who learned about India's civilization and its cultures through people and actually talking to Indians. The famous novelist Rudyard Kipling noted this trend when he said that Britain's knowledge of India, quote, gushed on the information front. But upon closer inspection, it was a limited knowledge. And it was, as we will see later, the Raj's racially driven insulation of itself from Indian people that caught them blindsided when Gandhi came onto the all-India scene after World War I. Also reflecting the racial underpinnings of the Raj and the way India was administered was how India was turned into a proper, formal imperial asset. One way the Raj sought to modernize India was through transport and communications, the technologies of the state. The British built railways, lots of them, with guaranteed returns to investors of anywhere between 5 and 6%. The British built what was by 1900 the third largest railway network in the entire world, with over 25,000 miles of track. This came at a cost of £150 million sterling. Indian railways were the single largest item of investment within the entire British Empire. Even a visitor to India today would be struck by the sheer extent of the railway system and how busy they are. And unlike many places in Western Europe today, Indian trains largely run on time. The other communication tool built up by the Raj was the telegraph. The telegraph was crucial. It not only made communication quicker within India, but also between India and London. Calcutta's authority grew with the expansion of the telegraph. But on the other hand, so did London's authority. Sent via submarine cables laid in the ocean beds, the telegraph allowed the British government to be in closer contact and hence have more supervision over Indian affairs. This allowed London to tighten its grip on the Raj, to regulate it more, and to extract more benefit from the Indian subcontinent. London could now communicate with Calcutta in 5 hours, rather than 5 months via steamship. Gone were the days of the 18th century company state. The Raj also built up a countrywide postal service, known as the Dak. It expanded significantly after the 1850s, and it was modeled after the penny post system back in Britain. This was important. It allowed easier communication within India between government officials, district collectors, and army generals. And even as late as 2003, some post in India was even sent via pigeon to precise locations and addresses. Now, the other big infrastructural development by 1900 was the expansion of education, and this deserves special mention. Universities were established in Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta by 1857, and their enrollments expanded after the 1870s. The Raj took on public education at the provincial levels, with publicly funded primary and secondary schools, high schools, and colleges. And even though education never received as much funding as the army or the ICS, it was still a crucial component of the Raj's overall administration. Now, you might be asking yourself, why would the British want English-educated Indians? Wouldn't they become more critical of their policies and the Raj? Well, the answer is rather complicated. The reality was that Britain needed English-literate Indians to keep the Raj's bureaucratic machinery humming. Britain was able to hold on to India after the 1857 uprising because of the army, but because it also had a supply of English-educated clerks, translators, and copyists. English-educated Indians worked in this larger, mind-numbing bureaucracy as typists, copyists, and secretarial workers. And while the British maintained their hold on the upper executive levels of power, Indians were the mortar of the whole bureaucratic edifice. So we can see how bureaucracy itself was a reflection of the Raj's racial attitudes. Now, let's step back for a moment and ask ourselves, why would they spend so much money on railways, telegraphs, universities, and postal systems? And that's another great question. There really are a few reasons. One, they benefited the army. Think about it. With railways, troops could be moved quickly around India. Memories of 1857 were still fresh in many minds, and the Indian army could now be quickly moved across the countryside to prevent any future uprisings. The other reason is simple: governance. Think about it. Is it easier to govern a country with or without national transportation networks? Well, the answer is obvious. And having telegraphs meant that orders from Calcutta, instead of being sent via horsemen, were sent electronically. Like in 19th century American and Western Europe, the expansion of communication and technology made the states governable. So India went through a modernization somewhat similar to that of the West. But Indians, unlike Germans, Americans, and Italians, were not master of their own fate, and they didn't even have a say in the way they were governed. All of these technological and bureaucratic changes combined, the British turned India into a colonial nation-state, ruled by Britain. This secured the Raj after 1857 and deep into the 20th century. Okay, we've covered a great deal today. At a higher level, we saw how the attitudes of the late governing Raj were manifest in the ways the country was administered, and how the ICS, the Indian Civil Service, functioned, staffed, and was administered. We saw how racism was reflected within this apparatus, and how the Raj's bureaucratic administration still tried to modernize India, just more surreptitiously and cautiously. We then looked at British forms of racism and how they created a template of Indians being unable to govern themselves. This created, as we've seen, the conceptual justification for the British Raj and for them to be in India in the first place. We then went on to look at the background of British administrators and saw that they largely came from more privileged elements of British society. Some of them, like the lower aristocracy, saw India as a vent of relief from a democratizing Britain. The upper middle classes, who were usually educated, saw Indians as little children who needed firm, parental British rule. Lastly, we looked at the Indian Civil Service and how its officers governed at the local village level. And we saw how their racial attitudes were reflected in the way they governed the structures of colonialism in India. So it's in this context that we will proceed to examine the emergence of more organized and indeed critical forms of Indian nationalism. For it was in the context of paternalistic, racially minded rule that some Indians saw the contradictions inherent in British rule. Drawing upon Indian and Western traditions, using English as a method of communication, the adversaries of British rule, very ironically, were not too dissimilar from the British themselves.